Adam Lambert didn't just walk off the American Idol stage and fade into the background like many expected. What followed was a series of decisions, controversies, and reinventions that quietly reshaped his entire career. From being publicly scrutinized over his identity to standing on the world's biggest stages with one of rock's most legendary bands, his journey has been anything but predictable. And just when it seemed like he had settled into that role, he made another unexpected turn that few people saw coming. The night fame turned into pressure. When Adam Lambert stepped onto the American Idol stage, he wasn't just another contestant with a good voice. He stood out immediately because of his theatrical delivery, his control, and the kind of stage presence that made him look more like a finished artist than a competitor. Week after week, he pushed boundaries with performances that leaned into glam rock influences, drawing inspiration from artists like Freddie Mercury and David Bowie. By the time the finale arrived, many viewers believed he was the clear winner. Instead, he finished as runner-up, a result that shocked both fans and critics and immediately raised questions about whether something beyond talent had influenced the outcome. That question became harder to ignore when private photos of Lambert kissing his ex-boyfriend surfaced during the competition. At a time when mainstream pop still struggled to fully accept openly gay artists, the reaction was intense. Conservative media figures criticized him publicly, while major publications framed his sexuality as a defining storyline rather than focusing on his performances. Lambert, who had already come out in his personal life years earlier, suddenly found himself forced into a very public version of that process on one of the largest television platforms in the country. What made the situation more complicated was the lack of any clear path forward. There were no widely visible examples of openly gay male artists succeeding at that level in mainstream pop. Lambert later admitted that he had no guide for how to navigate the situation, and that realization hit him quickly. He began to understand that his identity was becoming bigger in the public conversation than his music, something he found deeply frustrating because it shifted attention away from the work he had spent years developing. After the show ended, Lambert confirmed his sexuality in a major magazine interview, hoping to regain control of the narrative. Instead, the response was mixed. Some critics argued he should have addressed it earlier, while others claimed they felt misled. At the same time, he faced pressure from within the industry to adjust how he presented himself. Early in his career, even small details became battlegrounds. A lyric in one of his songs was changed to avoid directly referencing a male relationship, and there were concerns about whether his image would be accepted in more conservative retail spaces. Despite all of this, Lambert chose not to completely retreat. He made a calculated decision to stay visible, even if it meant compromising in certain areas to keep his career moving forward. That choice defined the early phase of his post-Idol journey. Instead of disappearing after controversy, he leaned into the attention, releasing his debut album, which entered the charts strongly and produced a Grammy-nominated single. It was a sign that, even under pressure, he could translate visibility into success. But the real turning point came not from his music, but from a single performance that would push him directly into the center of a national debate. The controversy that nearly closed every door. The moment that truly tested Adam Lambert's place in the industry did not come quietly. It happened on a live award stage in front of millions of viewers during a performance that was meant to introduce his new era. Instead, it triggered a backlash that spread far beyond music. During that appearance, Lambert included a brief kiss with a male band member as part of the performance. In another context, it might have passed without much reaction, but at that time, it immediately became a national controversy. Complaints were filed, advocacy groups demanded consequences, and within hours, the network that had scheduled him for a major morning show appearance removed him from the lineup. What followed exposed a double standard that Lambert had already begun to sense during his time on television. When similar moments involving female performers had aired in previous years, they were replayed, discussed, and even celebrated. In his case, the reaction was sharply different. Footage of the performance was censored in certain broadcasts, and when comparisons were made on television between his performance and earlier pop culture moments, his was the only one visibly blurred. That contrast made the situation impossible to ignore. It was no longer just about one performance, but about how differently the industry and media treated expressions of identity depending on who was involved. At the same time, the commercial side of the music business began to push back more aggressively. There were ongoing conversations about whether his image was too much for mainstream audiences. Some executives questioned whether his visual style, combined with his openness about his sexuality, would limit radio play or retail support. Even when he had creative ideas for singles that leaned into his glam influences, those choices were sometimes rejected for being too flamboyant. The message was clear. There were boundaries, and crossing them could come at a cost. Lambert found himself facing a decision that many artists never have to confront so early in their careers. He could push back fully and risk losing opportunities, or he could adapt strategically while maintaining as much of his identity as possible. He chose the second path, not because he agreed with the limitations, but because he understood the long-term stakes. He later described this period as a balancing act between staying true to himself and ensuring that his career could continue to grow rather than stall. That balancing act shaped the direction of his next major project. Instead of doubling down on shock value or controversy, he shifted toward a more controlled and polished sound. The album that followed still carried elements of his identity, but it was noticeably more restrained in tone. While some critics viewed this as a step back, it served a different purpose. It allowed him to stabilize his position in the industry at a time when many doors were starting to close. Yet even as he adjusted his approach, Lambert knew that something was missing. The environment he was working in still came with expectations that limited how freely he could express himself. He needed a space where those constraints did not exist, where he could perform without being told to hold back. That opportunity arrived in a way that completely changed the trajectory of his career, connecting him with a legacy that was far bigger than anything he had experienced up to that point. The unexpected partnership that redefined everything. The shift Adam Lambert had been searching for did not come from a new producer or a different label strategy. It came from a collaboration that, at first, seemed almost impossible. When he first shared a stage with Brian May and Roger Taylor, it was during a televised event where he performed one of Queen's most iconic songs. What stood out immediately was not just his vocal ability, but his understanding of the theatricality that had always defined the band. That performance led to further invitations, and what began as a one-off appearance slowly evolved into something much larger. As the collaboration deepened, Lambert found himself stepping into a role that came with enormous expectations. Freddie Mercury was not just a frontman, but a defining figure in rock history, and any attempt to revisit that legacy carried risk. From the beginning, Lambert made it clear that he was not trying to replace Mercury. Instead, he approached the role as an interpreter, someone who could bring his own perspective to the material while honoring what had come before. That distinction allowed audiences to accept him in a way that might not have been possible otherwise. Touring with Queen gave Lambert something he had not fully experienced in his solo career: complete creative freedom on stage. In that environment, there were no conversations about whether he was too much, or whether his style needed to be toned down. The very elements that had once been questioned in the industry became strengths. His theatrical instincts, his vocal range, and his ability to move between dramatic and intimate moments all aligned with the band's identity. Over time, what started as a cautious experiment turned into a long-term partnership that lasted for more than a decade. The scale of those tours changed Lambert's career in measurable ways. Performing in arenas and stadiums around the world, he reached audiences far beyond the fan base he had built after American Idol. The collaboration also introduced Queen's music to a new generation, creating a bridge between eras that few artists are able to achieve. A live album capturing that experience was later released, documenting how seamlessly Lambert had integrated into the band's legacy without overshadowing it. At the same time, this partnership provided something more personal. After years of navigating an industry that often placed limits on how he could present himself, Lambert found a space where those limits did not apply. He described it as a place where he was no longer being told what audiences would or would not accept. Instead, he could exist on stage exactly as he was, without filtering his identity or his performance style. That sense of acceptance became a turning point, not just professionally, but in how he viewed his role as an artist. However, success with Queen also created a new question. As the tours continued and the collaboration grew stronger, there were discussions about whether this role might overshadow his own work. Lambert pushed back against that idea, insisting that the two paths could exist side by side. While he continued to develop his solo music, the partnership with Queen remained a central part of his career, proving that he did not have to choose between honoring a legacy and building his own. The return to the stage that changed his image again. When the global touring cycle with Queen slowed down after years of back-to-back performances, Adam Lambert did not immediately replace it with another large-scale music project. Instead, he turned in a direction that many casual fans did not expect, but one that had been part of his identity long before he became famous. He went back to theater. This was not a temporary experiment or a side project. It was a deliberate move that reconnected him with the foundation of his career, something he had set aside when American Idol changed his path. Lambert's decision to step into a major stage production marked his first return to theatrical performance since his early years working in Los Angeles, where he had spent time developing his craft before entering the music industry. That return carried a level of risk, because it placed him in a different kind of spotlight. Unlike a concert, where the audience expects to see him as himself, theater required him to fully inhabit a character, to serve a narrative rather than lead one. It demanded discipline, consistency, and a different kind of emotional control. His role as the MC in the revival of Cabaret became the centerpiece of that transition. The character itself is complex, provocative, and deliberately ambiguous, existing at the intersection of performance, identity, and social commentary. For Lambert, the role was not just a casting decision, but a reflection of themes he had already lived through in his own career. The MC's world, built around expression, freedom, and the tension between individuality and societal pressure, mirrored many of the challenges Lambert had faced since his earliest days in the public eye. What made this transformation particularly striking was the visual and stylistic shift that accompanied it. Lambert introduced a completely new look for the role, moving away from the image many people still associated with him from his early career. The styling, the makeup, and the overall presentation were designed to align with the character's theatrical nature, but they also signaled that Lambert was still willing to evolve rather than rely on a familiar identity. For audiences who had followed him since American Idol, the contrast was impossible to ignore. At the same time, Lambert spoke openly about why the story of Cabaret felt relevant to him. He described it as a narrative about freedom, individuality, and the danger of those things being taken away under certain conditions. Those themes connected directly to his experiences as an openly gay artist navigating an industry that had not always been welcoming. By stepping into that role, he was not just performing a character, but engaging with ideas that had shaped his own life. A quiet personal shift and a new chapter ahead. While Adam Lambert's career continued to evolve in highly visible ways, one of the most significant changes in his life happened without the same level of attention. After more than 4 years together, he and Oliver Gliese quietly ended their relationship. There was no public fallout, no dramatic statements, and no attempt to turn the separation into a headline moment. According to reports, the relationship simply reached a natural conclusion. For an artist whose early career had been shaped by intense public scrutiny, the way this chapter ended was noticeably different. It reflected a level of control over his personal life that he had not always been able to maintain in the past. The relationship itself had been a stable presence during a period when Lambert was balancing multiple roles across music, touring, and performance. Glisa, who worked in the fashion industry, was often seen supporting him at events and shows, and their partnership was built on strong communication, something Lambert had openly emphasized in interviews. That foundation made the quiet nature of their separation even more telling. Rather than becoming a source of controversy, it remained a private transition, allowing Lambert to move forward without the kind of external pressure that had defined earlier moments in his career. At the same time, his professional focus was shifting once again. With Queen taking a break following the conclusion of their major global tour, Lambert began directing his attention back to his own music. He confirmed that new material was already in development, describing it as a completely new direction without revealing specific details. This signaled the beginning of another phase in his career, one that would be shaped more by his individual creative decisions than by collaboration. After years of balancing his identity between solo artist and frontman for one of rock's most iconic bands, he was preparing to re-establish his own voice in a different way. Beyond music, Lambert continued to expand his presence in theater, taking on another major role that further reinforced his connection to the stage. For him, this was not a departure from his career, but a return to something that had always been part of it. He has often described theater as the place where he first learned to fight for what he wanted and to push himself to improve. That mindset carried into his current work, influencing how he approached both performance and creative development. At the same time, his role as an advocate remained central to everything he was doing. Having experienced firsthand the challenges of being openly gay in a mainstream industry that was not always supportive, Lambert has consistently used his platform to support LGBTQ+ causes and broader human rights efforts. He has participated in major charity events, contributed to campaigns focused on equality and mental health, and supported organizations working directly with vulnerable communities. For him, these efforts are not separate from his career, but an extension of it, a way to use visibility for a purpose that goes beyond entertainment. So after everything Adam Lambert has gone through, which version of him do you think stands out the most? The fearless contestant, the controversial performer, or the artist he has become today? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories like this.